Honey, you're embarrassing us. Could you please go help in the kitchen instead of sitting with the actual successful members of this family? Those were the exact words my cousin Vivian said to me at my grandmother's 85th birthday celebration last month. I'm Alexandra Rivera. I'm 29 years old and I own Sunset Dining Group, a restaurant empire worth over $50 million that spans across 7 states. But there I was, standing in my own flagship restaurant in downtown Millbrook Heights, being told by my family that I didn't belong at their table because I was just a waitress. What they didn't know was that the elegant establishment they had chosen for our family's most important celebration, the place where they were currently sipping $200 bottles of wine and acting like they owned the place, was actually mine. Every single crystal glass they were drinking from, every piece of imported Italian marble under their designer shoes, every carefully curated piece of art on those walls, I had personally selected it all. The staff members they were treating like servants? They were my employees, people I had hired, trained, and provided excellent benefits for. The little waitress job they constantly mocked me for, it was actually me checking in on my investment, making sure my customers were getting the 5-star experience that had earned us recognition in Food & Wine magazine 3 years running. But my family had no clue. To them, I was still the same girl who had disappointed everyone by choosing to work in restaurants instead of becoming a lawyer like my cousin Vivian, or a doctor like my brother Daniel, or even a teacher like my sister Penelope. They saw the uniform, they saw me carrying plates, and they immediately assumed I was stuck in some dead-end job, struggling to make ends meet, while they climbed their respectable career ladders. The irony was absolutely delicious. There they were, in their expensive suits and dresses, talking loudly about their salaries and their achievements, completely oblivious to the fact that the unsuccessful family member they were publicly humiliating probably earned more in a single month than most of them made in an entire year. Vivian, who loved to brag about her law firm partnership, had no idea that I could buy and sell her firm without even checking my bank balance. Daniel, who never missed an opportunity to mention his medical practice, didn't realize that my restaurant group's annual revenue dwarfed his clinic's profits by millions. For years, I had endured their condescending comments, their pitying looks, their not-so-subtle suggestions that I should get serious about my future and find a real career. Every family gathering was the same routine. They would talk about their professional accomplishments while shooting glances in my direction, sometimes even openly discussing how worried they were about me wasting my life in the food service industry. They would make jokes about how I probably couldn't even afford to eat at nice restaurants, let alone understand fine dining. The assumption was always that I was living paycheck to paycheck, probably sharing some tiny apartment with roommates, desperately serving other people because I had no other options. If only they knew that I had started with a single food truck in a riverside park 8 years ago, working 18-hour days and sleeping in the truck between shifts. If only they understood that I had built my empire, one customer at a time, one perfect dish at a time, and one 5-star review at a time. While they were climbing corporate ladders and impressing their bosses, I was creating jobs, transforming neighborhoods, and building something that would last for generations. But that night, sitting at what was essentially the kids' table in my own restaurant while my family celebrated without me, I decided things were about to change dramatically. You see, I had invited a very special guest to join us for dessert, someone who would be making a little announcement that would completely shatter their perception of who I really was and what I had actually accomplished. The moment when the regional food critic from Metropolitan Dining magazine walked through those doors with a photographer asking specifically to speak with Alexandra Rivera, the visionary owner and founder of Sunset Dining Group, I knew their smug little hierarchy was about to crumble faster than a poorly made souffle. Have you ever been underestimated by your own family? Have you ever had relatives treat you like a failure because they couldn't see past their own narrow definitions of success?
Tell me your story in the comments below. I read every single one, and I love hearing about how you proved the doubters wrong. And if you want to hear exactly how my family's jaws hit the floor when they realized their poor little waitress was actually their richest relative, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe because this story gets so much better. Trust me, the look on Vivian's face when she realized she had been lecturing a multi-millionaire about getting her life together was absolutely priceless. This is a story about family, assumptions, and the sweet taste of vindication, served at exactly the right temperature. Stick around because what happened next changed everything, and I promise you, you'll want to hear every single detail of how my relatives went from treating me like the family disappointment to suddenly being very, very interested in reconnecting and getting to know me better. The truth has a funny way of coming out, especially when it's being announced by a food critic in front of your entire extended family.
Let me properly introduce myself and tell you exactly how I went from being the family disappointment to building one of the most successful restaurant empires in the region. I'm Alexandra Rivera, and at 29 years old, I'm the founder and CEO of Sunset Dining Group, which operates 23 upscale restaurants across 7 states from California to Texas. Our flagship location alone, the very restaurant where my family decided to humiliate me, pulls in over $2.8 million annually. But here's what makes this story even more incredible. I didn't inherit a single dollar to start this empire. I didn't have wealthy parents writing checks or family connections opening doors. Everything I built came from 8 years of pure determination, strategic thinking, and an absolute refusal to let anyone else define what success looks like for me. When I say I own these restaurants, I don't mean I'm a silent partner or that I bought into someone else's concept. I mean I created every single aspect of these businesses from scratch. I developed the signature recipes that food critics now rave about. I designed the elegant interior spaces that have been featured in Architectural Digest twice. I built the staff training programs that have become the gold standard in our industry. I negotiated every real estate deal, secured every loan, and made every crucial decision that transformed my vision into a multi-million-dollar reality. My restaurants aren't just successful, they're award-winning. Sunset Dining Group has been recognized by the National Restaurant Association as Rising Empire of the Year for 3 consecutive years. Our head chef at the Millbrook Heights location, who I personally recruited from a Michelin-starred restaurant in San Francisco, has won the James Beard Regional Chef Award. Food and Wine magazine didn't just review us, they featured our story as their cover article titled "The Young Visionary Revolutionizing Fine Dining." The numbers speak for themselves. $50 million in total company valuation, over 400 employees across all locations, and profit margins that would make most established restaurant groups envious. Last quarter alone, we exceeded projected revenue by 35%. I am not just successful in the restaurant industry, I'm being studied by business schools as an example of innovative entrepreneurship and rapid scaling. But perhaps what I'm most proud of is what I've built beyond the financial success. Every single one of my employees receives healthcare benefits, paid vacation time, and opportunities for advancement that are almost unheard of in this industry. I've created profit-sharing programs that have allowed servers and kitchen staff to earn enough to buy homes, pay for their children's college education, and build real financial security. 3 of my current restaurant managers started as dishwashers and worked their way up through training programs I personally designed. The business publications have taken notice too. Forbes included me in their 30 under 30 list for food and drink, calling me a disruptive force who's redefining hospitality excellence. Entrepreneur magazine featured our expansion strategy as a case study in how to scale without losing your soul. I've been invited to speak at restaurant industry conferences across the country, sharing insights about sustainable growth and employee empowerment.
What my family saw when they looked at me, someone in a work uniform carrying plates, was actually the CEO making sure every detail of the customer experience met my exacting standards. Those weren't the desperate actions of someone with no other options. They were the hands-on leadership style of someone who built something extraordinary and refused to manage it from some distant corporate office. The contrast between their perception and my reality was staggering. While Vivian was bragging about her law firm partnership that probably earned her $300,000 a year, I was quietly running a company that generated more revenue in a single busy weekend than her entire annual salary. While Daniel was discussing his medical practice's patient load, I was employing more people than his clinic and 3 other medical offices combined. But here's what makes the story even more incredible. I had specifically chosen the Millbrook Heights location for grandmother's celebration because I wanted to give my family the very best experience possible. I had personally coordinated with my executive chef to create a special tasting menu. I had arranged for our sommelier to select wines that would perfectly complement each course. I had even blocked off our private dining room, which normally requires a $5,000 minimum, because I wanted this night to be perfect for the woman who had always believed in me, even when the rest of the family didn't. And there I was, being treated like hired help in the very establishment I had built as a love letter to everything I'd learned about hospitality, excellence, and creating unforgettable experiences. Growing up in the affluent suburb of Westfield Manor, success was measured in very specific terms. Advanced degrees, prestigious professions, and the kind of careers that came with impressive titles you could drop at country club gatherings. My family, the Riveras, had been pillars of this community for 3 generations. My grandfather had been a prominent surgeon, my father was a federal judge, and my mother served on the boards of half the cultural institutions in the city. In this world of carefully manicured lawns and even more carefully curated reputations, there was an unspoken hierarchy of acceptable career paths. Medicine topped the list, followed closely by law, then finance, then perhaps academia or high-level corporate positions. Everything else was viewed as either a stepping stone to something better or a disappointing failure to live up to family potential.
My cousin Vivian Lancaster embodied everything our family valued. At 32, she was a senior partner at Hartwell Myers & Associates, one of the most prestigious law firms in the tri-state area. She specialized in corporate litigation, commanded fees of $800 per hour, and had been featured in Legal Eagle magazine as one of the top 40 under 40 attorneys to watch. Vivian lived in a sprawling colonial in the most exclusive part of Westfield Manor, drove a brand-new BMW, and had married another successful attorney who worked in mergers and acquisitions. But Vivian's success came with a superiority complex that made family gatherings insufferable. She had this way of turning every conversation into an opportunity to showcase her achievements while subtly undermining everyone else's. She would casually mention her latest high-profile case, drop the names of Fortune 500 clients, or talk about her recent vacation to some exotic location that most people couldn't afford. Her favorite target? Me. My brother Daniel was almost as bad, though he wrapped his condescension in a veneer of medical authority. Dr. Daniel Rivera had opened his own orthopedic practice 5 years ago and never let anyone forget it. He drove a Tesla with vanity plates that read Bones MV and somehow managed to work his medical degree into every conversation within the first 5 minutes. Daniel lived in a modern minimalist house that looked like it belonged in a medical journal, complete with abstract art and furniture that prioritized aesthetics over comfort. Daniel had this infuriating habit of psychoanalyzing my career choice as if it were a medical condition that needed treatment. Alexandra's restaurant phase is clearly a manifestation of her need for immediate gratification, he once explained to our uncle at a Christmas dinner, speaking about me as if I wasn't sitting right there. The food service industry provides instant feedback and validation that she's not getting from more challenging career paths. It's quite common among people who struggle with delayed gratification. Then there was my sister Penelope, who taught high school English at the most prestigious private academy in Westfield Manor.
While teaching wasn't quite as prestigious as law or medicine in our family's eyes, Penelope had managed to elevate her position by constantly emphasizing how she was shaping young minds and preparing the next generation of leaders. She had a master's degree in education from Columbia and never missed an opportunity to quote literature or make intellectual references that made everyone else feel less educated. Penelope's approach to putting me down was more subtle, but equally devastating. She would recommend books about finding your life's purpose, or suggest that I consider going back to school to discover what you're really passionate about. She once gave me a career counseling book for my birthday with a note that read, "Never too late to find your true calling." The implication was always clear. What I was doing wasn't my true calling, just a temporary detour until I figured out what I really wanted to do with my life. The family dynamics were most obvious during our monthly Sunday dinners at my parents' house. These gatherings followed a predictable pattern. Everyone would gather in the formal living room with cocktails while sharing updates about their professional lives. Vivian would discuss her latest courtroom victory, Daniel would mention a complex surgery he'd performed, and Penelope would talk about her students' achievements or her latest academic conference. When it came to me, the conversation would either shift abruptly to other topics, or someone would ask a patronizing question like, "How's the restaurant treating you, honey?" with the tone you'd use to ask a child about their lemonade stand. They never asked about business strategies, expansion plans, or industry trends. They treated my work like a hobby that I'd eventually outgrow once I came to my senses and pursued a real career. My parents, Judge Robert Rivera and Dr. Catherine Rivera, tried to maintain neutrality, but their disappointment was palpable. They had spent thousands of dollars on my private school education, expecting it to launch me towards law school or medical school like my siblings. Instead, their youngest daughter was wearing an apron and taking food orders. At family events, I could see them making excuses for me to their friends. "Alexandra is still figuring things out," or "she's always been our creative one." The extended family was even worse. My Aunt Beatrice, who had married into old money, would pat my hand sympathetically and say things like, "Don't worry, dear, everyone finds their path eventually." My Uncle Charles, a JP investment banker, would occasionally offer to set me up with some entry-level positions at respectable companies because he knew people who could help him transition into something more suitable. But perhaps the most insulting part was how they talked about the restaurant industry itself. They viewed it as inherently less valuable, less intellectual, less worthy of respect. They would make comments about how anyone can flip burgers, or joke about how restaurant workers were just people who couldn't hack it in real careers. They had no understanding of the complexity, creativity, business acumen, and sheer determination required to succeed in this industry. They saw uniforms and assumed incompetence. They saw service work and assumed failure. They looked at me carrying plates and saw someone who had given up on her potential rather than someone who was building an empire from the ground up. The irony was that while they sat in their offices managing other people's money, defending corporate interests, or teaching from textbooks, I was creating something tangible, building a business that employed hundreds of people and brought joy to thousands of customers every week.
This was the family dynamic I was walking into that night at grandmother's birthday celebration. A group of people who had spent years looking down on me, convinced they understood my life better than I did, completely unaware that the failure they pitied was about to reveal herself as the most successful person in the room. My rebellion against the family's expectations didn't happen overnight. It started when I was 16 and got my first job at Romano's Pizzeria, a small family-owned restaurant in downtown Westfield Manor. What began as a simple way to earn spending money for clothes and movies quickly became something much more significant. My first taste of the restaurant world, and the moment I discovered where I truly belonged. At Romano's, I wasn't Judge Rivera's daughter or Dr. Rivera's youngest child. I was just Alex, the enthusiastic teenager who showed up early for every shift and stayed late to help with closing duties. Mrs. Romano, the owner's wife, took me under her wing and taught me everything from how to properly fold napkins to the art of reading customers' moods. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was learning skills that mattered, contributing to something real, and being judged purely on my effort and attitude rather than my family's reputation. I loved everything about that job. I loved the controlled chaos of the dinner rush, the satisfaction of delivering a perfect order to a happy customer, and the camaraderie among the staff who worked together like a well-orchestrated team. I was fascinated by how the kitchen operated, how ingredients transformed into dishes that brought families together, and how the right atmosphere could turn a simple meal into a cherished memory. My family's reaction to my enthusiasm was swift and dismissive. When I came home excited about learning to work the espresso machine or proud that I'd been trusted to train a new server, they treated it like a cute phase that would pass once I got serious about my future. My father would chuckle and say, "That's nice, sweetheart, but don't let it distract you from your real studies." My mother would remind me that this was just a job, not a career path, and that I needed to keep my focus on college preparation. But the more they dismissed my passion, the more determined I became to prove them wrong. I started reading everything I could about the restaurant industry: business journals, culinary magazines, books about successful restaurateurs like Danny Meyer and Alice Waters, analyzing their business models and dreaming about what I could build. The real conflict erupted during my senior year of high school when college application deadlines were approaching. My parents had assumed I would apply to prestigious universities with strong liberal arts programs that would prepare me for law school, medical school, or at minimum, an MBA program. They had already scheduled meetings with college counselors and started talking about which family connections might help with admissions. Instead, I announced that I wanted to attend the Culinary Institute of America in New York City to study both culinary arts and restaurant management. The reaction was immediate and devastating. My father called it a complete waste of your potential and insisted that cooking was a hobby, not a profession for someone with your advantages. My mother cried and asked where they had gone wrong in raising me. The worst part was how they tried to intervene. They scheduled appointments with the school guidance counselor, asking her to talk sense into me about realistic career goals. They brought in my Uncle Charles to explain the financial benefits of traditional career paths. They even arranged for me to shadow Vivian at her law firm for a week, hoping that exposure to her glamorous legal career would snap me out of what they saw as a temporary delusion. But their efforts only strengthened my resolve. During that week at Vivian's law firm, I watched her spend 12-hour days buried in paperwork, arguing with opposing counsel over contracts, and billing clients for every 6-minute increment of her time. She seemed successful on paper, but she looked exhausted, stressed, and completely disconnected from any sense of joy or creativity in her work. The office was sterile, the conversations were purely transactional, and everyone seemed to be going through the motions of a career they'd chosen for prestige rather than passion. Meanwhile, I was still working part-time at Romano's, and every shift reminded me why I loved this industry. I loved how food brought people together, how a perfectly prepared meal could turn an ordinary evening into a celebration, and how hospitality could make strangers feel like family. I was energized by the fast pace, the problem solving, the creativity, and the immediate feedback from satisfied customers. The final confrontation came during Christmas dinner of my senior year. The whole extended family was gathered, and the conversation inevitably turned to college plans. When I mentioned the Culinary Institute, the table went silent. Then the interrogation began. Uncle Charles asked why I would want to waste my intelligence on manual labor. Aunt Beatrice wondered out loud if this was some kind of rebellious phase. Vivian, who was already in law school at the time, launched into a lecture about how the restaurant industry had no job security, terrible hours, and minimal earning potential.
Daniel, who was finishing his pre-med studies, smugly explained that service jobs were fine for people without other options, but that someone with my family background and educational opportunities should aim higher.
My grandmother, Elena, the family matriarch, listened to all of this with increasing frustration. Finally, she stood up and silenced the room. "Enough," she said firmly. "Alexandra has found something she's passionate about, something that makes her happy, and all you can do is criticize her for not following your predetermined path." She looked around the table at each family member. "When I was her age, women couldn't even dream of owning businesses or being financially independent. Now she wants to build something of her own, and you're trying to talk her out of it?" That moment created a permanent rift in the family dynamics. My grandmother became my sole supporter, the only person who believed in my vision and encouraged me to pursue it. Everyone else settled into a pattern of polite disapproval, treating my career choice as a prolonged mistake that they hoped I'd eventually correct. They expected me to fail. They waited for me to come crawling back, ready to enroll in a proper degree program and join the family tradition of conventional success. They saw my acceptance to the Culinary Institute not as an achievement, but as a wrong turn that would eventually lead me back to the right path. What they didn't understand was that their disapproval had become fuel for my ambition. Every dismissive comment, every concerned look, every suggestion that I was wasting my potential only made me more determined to prove them spectacularly wrong. I wasn't just going to succeed in the restaurant industry. I was going to build something so impressive, so undeniably successful, that they would have no choice but to acknowledge their mistake. The years that followed my graduation from the Culinary Institute were a masterclass in family condescension disguised as concern. Every milestone I achieved, every step forward in my career, was met with the same patronizing response. Polite acknowledgement followed by subtle suggestions that I should consider transitioning to something more stable. When I landed my first job as a line cook at Meridian, an upscale restaurant in Manhattan, my family's reaction was telling. Instead of congratulating me on being hired at one of the city's most competitive kitchens, my father asked how much I was making per hour, and then calculated how that compared to what I could be earning if I had gone to law school. Vivian helpfully pointed out that her starting salary as a first-year associate was more than triple what I was making, conveniently ignoring that she was also working 80-hour weeks and hadn't had a weekend off in 6 months. The dismissal escalated when I was promoted to sous chef after just 18 months. This was actually a remarkable achievement in the notoriously hierarchical world of fine dining, where most cooks spend years working their way up from the bottom. The executive chef had specifically chosen me over several more experienced candidates because of my innovative flavor combinations and my ability to manage kitchen operations during busy service periods. When I called home to share this news, my mother's first response was, "That's nice, dear, but don't you think it's time to start thinking about your long-term future?" She then launched into a story about her friend's daughter who had gone back to school at 25 to become a physician's assistant and was now doing so well for herself. The subtext was clear. My achievements in the restaurant world didn't count as doing well by their standards. Daniel was particularly insufferable during this period. He had just completed his residency and was constantly lecturing me about building equity in your career. He would say things like, "The problem with restaurant work is that you're just trading time for money. You're not building anything lasting or valuable." This from someone who was essentially an employee at a hospital, while I was learning every aspect of restaurant operations and developing the skills that would eventually allow me to build my own empire. The worst part was how they talked about my work to other people. At family gatherings, when friends or relatives asked about me, they would describe my career in the most diminishing terms possible. "Alexandra's working in restaurants in New York," with the tone people usually reserve for discussing someone's unfortunate medical diagnosis. They never mentioned that I was working at some of the city's most prestigious establishments, learning from James Beard Award-winning chefs, or developing skills that would serve me for the rest of my career. When I moved to San Francisco to work as head chef at Coastal Kitchen, a farm-to-table restaurant that was gaining national attention, my family's response was predictably underwhelming.
Penelope asked if this meant I was still doing the cooking thing and wondered when I was going to settle down and find something more suitable for starting a family. The implication that my career was somehow incompatible with having a personal life was insulting and ironic, considering that Vivian's legal career had already contributed to one failed engagement because she was never available for her fiancé. The condescension reached new heights when I decided to open my first restaurant. I had spent 3 years saving every penny, working multiple jobs, and developing relationships with suppliers and investors. I had written a comprehensive business plan, secured financing, and found the perfect location in Oakland's emerging food district. This wasn't some impulsive decision. It was the culmination of years of strategic planning and industry experience. When I announced my plans to open Sunset Bistro, the family's reaction was a mixture of polite concern and barely concealed horror. My father immediately started talking about failure rates in the restaurant industry, citing statistics he had clearly Googled that morning. 90% of restaurants fail within the first year, he said gravely, as if I hadn't spent months researching every aspect of restaurant ownership and hadn't already accounted for the challenges in my business plan.
Vivian was even more direct in her disapproval. "Alexandria, you're basically gambling with your future," she said during a particularly uncomfortable phone conversation. "You could lose everything you've worked for. Why not get some real business experience first? Maybe an MBA, before you try something this risky." The irony was that I had more hands-on business experience than anyone else in the family, having worked in every aspect of restaurant operations, from inventory management to customer service to financial planning. The most hurtful response came from my Uncle Charles, who offered to help me find a sensible job in restaurant management at an established company so I could get this entrepreneurship thing out of my system without risking my financial future. He spoke as if my dream of owning my own restaurant was equivalent to wanting to run away and join the circus. Even when Sunset Bistro opened to rave reviews and was booked solid for its first 3 months, my family managed to find ways to diminish the achievement. Daniel suggested that the initial success was probably just novelty factor, and that the real test would be whether I could sustain it long term. My mother worried aloud about the stress I was putting myself under and suggested that maybe I should consider selling the restaurant to someone more experienced before I got in over my head. The pattern became exhaustingly predictable. Every success was minimized, every achievement was accompanied by warnings about the risks I was taking, and every conversation about my career inevitably led to suggestions that I should consider doing something else. They treated my restaurant like an expensive hobby that was getting out of hand, rather than the thriving business it actually was. When Sunset Bistro was featured in Food & Wine magazine as one of the best new restaurants on the West Coast, Vivian's response was to ask if the magazine had paid me for the article, completely missing the point that this was earned recognition from one of the industry's most respected publications. When I hired my 5th employee, Penelope wondered if I was taking on too much responsibility and suggested that maybe I should scale back before things get too complicated. The dismissal wasn't just about my career choices. It extended to every aspect of my life. They assumed that because I worked in restaurants, I must be struggling financially, living paycheck to paycheck, and constantly stressed about money. They had no idea that I was actually building significant wealth, investing in real estate, and developing multiple revenue streams. When I bought my first investment property, a duplex that I renovated and rented out for additional income, my family somehow managed to turn even this achievement into evidence of my poor judgment. "Real estate is so risky," my father warned. "You're spreading yourself too thin. Maybe you should focus on one thing at a time." They couldn't conceive that someone in the restaurant industry could be sophisticated enough to diversify their investments and build long-term wealth. This pattern of dismissal continued for years, creating a dynamic where I stopped sharing good news with my family because I knew it would be met with concern, criticism, or attempts to redirect me towards they considered more appropriate career paths.
They had created an environment where my successes were treated as problems to be solved rather than achievements to be celebrated. The breaking point came during last year's Easter dinner, an event that should have been a celebration but instead became the most humiliating experience of my adult life. By this time, I owned 3 successful restaurants and was in the process of expanding into 2 new markets. My original Sunset Bistro had been featured in Bon Appetit as one of the 50 best restaurants in America, and I had just signed a deal to open locations in Seattle and Portland. I was flying high, feeling more confident about my business acumen and my place in the industry. I had been particularly excited about this family gathering because I was finally ready to share some major news. I had just secured a $12 million investment deal that would allow me to expand Sunset Dining Group into 5 additional markets over the next 2 years. This wasn't just about opening a few more restaurants. It was about building a legitimate restaurant empire that would establish me as a major player in the industry. The investors included some of the most respected names in restaurant financing, people who had backed successful chains that were now worth hundreds of millions of dollars. I arrived at my parents' house in Westfield Manor carrying a bottle of Dom Perignon 2010 vintage that had cost me $400, planning to make a toast to share my incredible news with the family. I'd even prepared a small speech about how grateful I was for their support over the years, conveniently ignoring the fact that their support had been virtually non-existent. I was ready to be magnanimous in victory, to show them that I harbored no resentment for their years of doubt and dismissal. The entire extended family was there. Vivian and her husband Marcus, Daniel and his new girlfriend Caroline, Penelope and her fiancé Trevor, plus aunts, uncles, and cousins I hadn't seen in months. The house was buzzing with conversation about everyone's latest achievements. Vivian had just made senior partner at her law firm and was holding court in the living room describing her latest high-profile case involving a Fortune 500 company merger. Daniel was discussing a complex surgery he had performed the week before, using medical terminology that made everyone nod respectfully, even though most of them had no idea what he was talking about.
I waited patiently for the right moment to share my news, listening to everyone else's updates and feeling increasingly excited about dropping my bombshell. When there was finally a lull in the conversation, I stood up with my champagne bottle and cleared my throat. I have some exciting news to share with everyone, I began, feeling more confident than I had at any family gathering in years. Before I could say another word, Vivian interrupted with a condescending smile. "Oh, let me guess," she said, loudly enough for the entire room to hear. "You're opening another little restaurant? That's nice, Alexandra, but maybe you should think about diversifying your interests. The restaurant business is so unstable, and you're not getting any younger. Have you considered what you'll do when you can't keep up with the physical demands of restaurant work?" The room went quiet, and I felt my face flush with embarrassment. But Vivian wasn't finished. She continued her lecture as if she were addressing a child who needed guidance from a responsible adult. "I've been thinking about your situation a lot lately, and I really think you should consider going back to school. Maybe get an MBA, or even look into law school. It's never too late to change directions, and you could probably leverage your restaurant experience into something more substantial. I know people who could help you transition into corporate consulting or restaurant law." Daniel jumped in to support his cousin's intervention. "Vivian's right, Alex. I've been worried about you too. The restaurant industry is incredibly stressful, and I see the physical toll it takes on people. Long hours, constant pressure, no real benefits or job security. You're smart enough to do anything you want. Why limit yourself to a career that's essentially manual labor?" The humiliation was complete when my mother joined the pile-on. "We've all been discussing this," she said, looking around the room for support from other family members. "We love you, sweetheart, but we're concerned that you're not thinking about your future. What happens when you want to start a family? How will you manage restaurants and children? And what about retirement planning? Do restaurants even offer 401k plans?" I sat there holding my $400 bottle of champagne, which now felt like a ridiculous prop in this intervention that I hadn't seen coming.
The news I had been so excited to share, news about a multi-million-dollar expansion that would establish me as a legitimate business mogul, died in my throat. How could I tell them about investor meetings and market expansion strategies when they were treating me like a confused child who needed career counseling? Uncle Charles, emboldened by the family's unified concern, decided to offer his own solution. Alexandra, I've actually been looking into some opportunities that might be perfect for you. There's a restaurant management company that handles operations for hotel chains. They're looking for someone with your experience, but it would give you real corporate structure, benefits, and growth potential. I could set up an interview. The worst part was how pleased they all looked with themselves, as if they had just performed an act of loving intervention rather than a coordinated attack on everything I had built. They genuinely believed they were helping me by suggesting that I abandon my successful restaurants to become an employee at someone else's company. I excused myself to the bathroom and stood in front of the mirror, staring at my reflection and trying to process what had just happened. Here I was, someone who employed over 200 people across multiple states, being lectured about job security and career planning by people who had never risked a penny of their own money or built anything from scratch. I was being advised to seek real corporate structure by relatives who had no idea that I was already running a multi-million-dollar corporation that I had built with my own hands. When I returned to the living room, the conversation had moved on to other topics, but the damage was done. I sat quietly for the rest of the evening, contributing nothing to conversations and counting the minutes until I could politely leave. The champagne bottle remained unopened on the coffee table, a symbol of the celebration that never happened. I drove back to my hotel that night feeling more isolated from my family than ever before. The excitement about my expansion deal had been completely crushed by their intervention, and I realized that no matter what I achieved, they would always see me as the family member who had made the wrong choice and needed to be rescued from her own poor judgment. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I was done trying to win their approval or prove my worth through their narrow definition of success. I was done sharing my achievements with people who couldn't recognize achievement when it was sitting right in front of them. From that point forward, I decided to focus entirely on building my empire without seeking validation from family members who were incapable of providing it. The irony was that their intervention, intended to redirect my career towards something they considered more acceptable, actually had the opposite effect. Instead of making me question my choices, it made me more determined than ever to build something so undeniably successful that their opinions would become irrelevant. I left that Easter dinner not defeated, but galvanized, ready to prove them wrong in the most spectacular way possible.
After the Easter dinner debacle, I maintained minimal contact with my family for 8 months. I sent polite text messages for birthdays, exchanged brief pleasantries during obligatory holiday phone calls, and declined every invitation to family gatherings with carefully crafted excuses about work obligations. It wasn't difficult to avoid them. My business was genuinely demanding more of my time than ever before, and I was traveling constantly to oversee the expansion of Sunset Dining Group. During those months of self-imposed exile, something remarkable happened. Without the constant drain of family disapproval, my business flourished beyond my wildest expectations. The $12 million investment I had been so excited to share at Easter turned into $25 million when 2 additional investment groups expressed interest in backing my expansion. By fall, I had opened locations in Seattle, Portland, Denver, and Austin, each one more successful than the last. My Seattle location broke opening week revenue records for upscale dining establishments in the Pacific Northwest. The Portland restaurant was booked solid for 3 months in advance within 2 weeks of opening. Food critics in every new market were calling Sunset Dining Group the most exciting restaurant concept to emerge in the past decade. I wasn't just building a business anymore. I was creating a culinary empire that was being studied by restaurant industry analysts and business schools. But the most significant development was personal rather than professional. I had finally found my people. a network of successful entrepreneurs, investors, and industry leaders who understood what I was building and celebrated my achievements without reservation. My business partner and closest friend, Carmen Rodriguez, had become like a sister to me. Carmen owned a successful catering company in San Francisco, and she had been instrumental in connecting me with the right investors and helping me navigate the complexities of multi-state expansion. Carmen understood the restaurant industry in a way my family never could. She knew that what I was building required not just culinary skills, but sophisticated understanding of real estate, finance, human resources, supply chain management, and brand development. When I shared my victories with Carmen, she celebrated them appropriately. When I faced challenges, she offered practical advice rather than suggestions that I should consider a different career entirely. It was Carmen who first suggested that I was being too generous in cutting my family slack for their inability to understand my success. "Alexandra," she said during one of our weekly business dinners, "you've built something extraordinary. You employ over 400 people across 6 states. You're generating revenue that most established restaurant groups would envy. Why do you keep seeking approval from people who are clearly incapable of recognizing excellence when it's sitting right in front of them?" Her point hit home, but I still wasn't ready to completely write off my family. Despite everything, I held on to hope that eventually they would see what I had accomplished and acknowledge that their concerns had been unfounded. Deep down, I wanted them to be proud of me, even though I had stopped expecting it. That fragile hope was tested when my grandmother Elena called in late November with news that changed everything. She was turning 85 in December, and she wanted to have a celebration that brought the whole family together. "Alexandra, mi nieta," she said in the mix of English and Spanish she used when she was being particularly affectionate. "I know things have been difficult with the family, but this might be my last big birthday. I need you there." My grandmother was the only family member who had consistently supported my career choices, the only one who had celebrated my successes without qualification. When Sunset Bistro first opened, she had driven 3 hours from Westfield Manor to Oakland to be my first customer, ordering every item on the menu and leaving a review on Yelp that made me cry with gratitude. When I opened my second location, she sent flowers and a card that read, "Proud of my granddaughter, the businesswoman." Elena had always been different from the rest of my family. She had immigrated to the United States as a young woman with nothing but determination and a willingness to work harder than anyone around her. She understood what it meant to build something from scratch, to take risks that others thought were foolish, and to persist in the face of doubt and criticism. While the rest of my family had inherited their privileged positions in Westfield Manor society, my grandmother had earned hers through decades of smart decisions and relentless effort. The call put me in an impossible position. I genuinely wanted to honor my grandmother's wishes and celebrate this milestone with her, but I dreaded the prospect of facing my family again. I knew that 8 months hadn't changed their fundamental attitude toward my career, and I wasn't sure I had the emotional energy to endure another round of condescending concern about my life choices. Carmen, as usual, offered the perspective I needed. "You can't let their ignorance rob you of time with your grandmother," she said. "But you also can't go in there expecting them to have suddenly developed the capacity to understand what you've built. Go for Elena, celebrate her, and don't give the rest of them the power to diminish your achievements." The decision became easier when my grandmother mentioned that she wanted to have the celebration at that beautiful new restaurant Millbrook Heights that everyone's been talking about. She was referring to my newest location, Sunset Prime, which had opened just 6 weeks earlier in the heart of Westfield Manor's upscale dining district. The restaurant was my most ambitious project yet, a 200-seat fine dining establishment that showcased the best of what Sunset Dining Group had to offer.
Sunset Prime represented everything I had learned about creating exceptional dining experiences. The menu featured sophisticated interpretations of comfort food classics, prepared with techniques I had learned from James Beard award-winning chefs, and ingredients sourced from the finest purveyors in the region. The interior design, which I had personally overseen, balanced elegance with warmth,
creating an atmosphere that was impressive without being intimidating. The restaurant had been an immediate success, drawing diners from across the tri-state area and earning rave reviews from food critics who called it a masterclass in elevated comfort food and the kind of restaurant that elevates an entire dining scene. Within a month of opening, we were booked solid on weekends and had a waiting list for our chef's table that stretched 2 months out. The irony was delicious. My family would be celebrating my grandmother's birthday at a restaurant I owned, in the very town where they had spent years dismissing my career as a phase I would eventually outgrow. They would be dining on food prepared under my direction, in a space I had designed, surrounded by staff I had hired and trained. And they would have no idea that the little restaurant job they had been so concerned about had evolved into ownership of the very establishment where they were choosing to celebrate one of their most important family occasions. I accepted my grandmother's invitation with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. I was genuinely thrilled to celebrate her milestone birthday, and I was secretly delighted by the opportunity to watch my family enjoy an evening in my restaurant without knowing they were supporting the very career they had tried so hard to redirect. But I was also nervous about how they would treat me, whether they would resume their pattern of condescending concern, and whether I would be able to maintain my composure if they did. As I made reservations for the family celebration at my own restaurant, I realized that this evening would either be a turning point in my relationship with my family or the final confirmation that we were simply too different to understand each other. Either way, it was going to be a night to remember. I flew into Newark Airport on a Friday evening, exactly 2 days before grandmother's birthday celebration. The plan was to spend the weekend in Westfield Manor, attend the dinner on Sunday, and fly back to San Francisco on Monday morning. I had deliberately kept the trip short to minimize opportunities for extended family interactions that might reignite old conflicts. My first mistake was agreeing to stay at my parents' house instead of booking a hotel. I told myself it was because I wanted to spend quality time with grandmother Elena, who would be staying in the guest room, but truthfully, I was hoping that 8 months apart might have softened my family's attitude toward my career. I was curious to see if distance had given them any perspective on their behavior at Easter dinner, or if they had perhaps heard about my expanding success through the local business community. The answer came within minutes of walking through the front door. My mother greeted me with a hug and immediately launched into what she clearly thought was encouraging news. "Oh, sweetheart, I'm so glad you're here. I have wonderful news. Patricia Hendricks, you remember her, she's on the hospital board with me. She mentioned that there's an opening for food service director at Westfield General. It's a management position with excellent benefits, and they're specifically looking for someone with restaurant experience to modernize their dining operations." Before I could even set down my luggage, she was presenting me with a job opportunity that represented everything I had been trying to escape: corporate bureaucracy, someone else's vision, and a salary cap that was probably less than what I made in a single busy weekend at any one of my restaurants. The fact that she thought this was wonderful news told me immediately that nothing had changed during our months apart. "Mom," I said carefully, "I appreciate you thinking of me, but I'm not looking for employment opportunities right now. My business is doing really well, and I'm focused on expansion." I kept my tone neutral, hoping to avoid conflict before I'd even unpacked. "But honey," she persisted, "this would give you stability, real benefits, vacation time, a pension plan. You can't run restaurants forever, and this would be perfect preparation for when you're ready to settle down and start a family." The conversation was interrupted by Daniel's arrival. He had driven over specifically to see me, which I initially took as a positive sign, until he launched into his own version of helpful career advice. "Alex, I was just telling Carolyn about your situation, and she had a really interesting idea. She works for a medical device company that's expanding their corporate hospitality department. They're looking for someone to manage client entertainment and corporate dining events. It would be perfect for you. You'd get to use your restaurant background, but in a professional corporate environment." I stood in my childhood living room, surrounded by my luggage and family members who were treating my arrival like an intervention opportunity rather than a homecoming. They had clearly spent months discussing my situation and developing solutions for problems that existed only in their minds. The idea that I might be successful, happy, and perfectly capable of managing my own career apparently hadn't occurred to them. That's very thoughtful, I replied, but I'm actually doing exactly what I want to be doing. Business is better than ever. I decided to test the waters by sharing a small piece of good news. We just opened our 6th location, and it's been incredibly successful.
Daniel's response was immediately deflating. 6 restaurants, Alex? Don't you think you're overextending yourself? That sounds like an enormous amount of responsibility. How do you possibly manage the logistics of that many locations? And what happens if one of them fails? Wouldn't it be smarter to focus on one really successful restaurant rather than spreading yourself so thin? The pattern was exactly the same as always. Take any achievement and immediately reframe it as a problem that demonstrated poor judgment. 6 successful restaurants weren't evidence of business acumen. They were proof that I was taking on more than I could handle. Growth wasn't success. It was reckless expansion that would inevitably lead to failure. My father joined the conversation after dinner, and his approach was more subtle but equally dismissive. Alexandra, I've been thinking about our conversation at Easter, and I want you to know that we're not trying to control your life. We just worry about you being in such an unstable industry. I was reading an article in the Wall Street Journal about restaurant closures during economic downturns, and it reminded me how vulnerable your business model is to external factors. He had clearly done research specifically to support his position that my career choice was inherently risky. The fact that I had successfully weathered multiple economic challenges, including the recent supply chain disruptions that had forced many restaurants to close, didn't factor into his analysis. He was looking for evidence to support his predetermined conclusion rather than evaluating my actual track record. The weekend continued with a steady stream of similar interactions. Penelope called on Saturday morning to catch up, which turned into a 20-minute monologue about how her friend's sister had left restaurant management to become a corporate trainer and was so much happier now with work-life balance. Uncle Charles stopped by Saturday afternoon and somehow steered the conversation toward a connection he had in hotel management who was looking for experienced restaurant people to join their corporate team. Each family member seemed to have developed their own solution to what they perceived as my career problem, and they were all eager to share their findings. Nobody asked about my actual experiences, my financial situation, my future plans, or whether I was happy with my choices. They had decided that I needed rescuing, and they were determined to provide it, whether I wanted it or not. The most frustrating part was how they talked about the restaurant industry itself. They consistently used language that minimized the complexity and sophistication of what I did. I wasn't running a business. I was working in restaurants. I hadn't built an empire. I was opening more locations. I wasn't employing hundreds of people. I was taking on more responsibility than I could handle. Saturday evening, grandmother Elena and I finally had a private conversation in the garden behind my parents' house. She had been watching the family dynamics with growing frustration, and she didn't hold back her opinions. "Mija," she said, using the affectionate term that always made me feel loved and understood. "They mean well, but they don't understand what you've built. I see the reviews online. I read the articles about your restaurants. You're doing something remarkable, and they're too stuck in their own ideas about success to recognize it." Her validation meant everything to me, but it also highlighted how isolated I felt within my own family. The one person who understood and celebrated my achievements was 85 years old, and everyone else seemed determined to convince me that I was making a mistake that needed to be corrected. As Sunday morning arrived and we prepared for the birthday dinner at Sunset Prime, I realized that I was walking into the celebration with the same sense of dread I had felt before every family gathering for the past several years. Despite my hopes that time and distance might have changed the dynamic, my family was approaching this reunion with the same fundamental misunderstanding of who I was and what I had accomplished. The irony was about to become delicious. They would spend the evening dining at my restaurant, praising the food and ambiance I had created, while continuing to treat the creator of that experience as someone who needed their guidance and concern.
Sunday morning started with me secretly coordinating the most important dinner service of my career while my family remained completely oblivious to the fact that I was orchestrating every detail of their evening. At 6 a.m., while everyone else was still sleeping, I was on the phone with Marcus Chen, my executive chef at Sunset Prime, going over the final preparations for what I had told him was a very special family celebration that needed to be absolutely perfect. Marcus, I need tonight to be flawless, I whispered in the kitchen of my parents' house, cradling my coffee and speaking quietly to avoid waking anyone. This is my grandmother's 85th birthday, and she's the only family member who has ever supported my career. I want this to be the best dining experience she's ever had. What I didn't tell Marcus was that this dinner would also serve as the ultimate test of whether my family could recognize excellence when they were experiencing it firsthand. They would be tasting food prepared under my supervision in a restaurant I had designed with service standards I had personally developed, all while having no idea that their unsuccessful family member was responsible for every aspect of their experience. Marcus and I had worked together for 3 years, and he understood my vision better than anyone. Don't worry, Alexandra. We'll make this night unforgettable. I'm personally overseeing every dish that leaves the kitchen, and I've briefed the entire service team about the importance of this dinner.
I had spent weeks planning the menu specifically for this occasion, creating a special tasting experience that would showcase the sophistication and creativity that had made Sunset Dining Group famous. The evening would begin with a selection of artisanal appetizers that demonstrated our commitment to locally sourced ingredients and innovative flavor combinations. The main courses would feature elevated versions of classic comfort foods, dishes that were accessible enough for my family's conservative palates, but sophisticated enough to impress the most discerning food critics. For my grandmother, I had arranged something extra special, a recreation of her favorite dessert from her childhood in Mexico, but elevated with techniques I had learned from studying under pastry chefs in Paris. It was a tres leches cake infused with Mexican vanilla and topped with gold leaf, a perfect combination of traditional flavors and modern presentation that represented everything I loved about contemporary cuisine. While my family was getting ready for the evening, I was secretly coordinating with Sarah Mitchell, my general manager, about the service details. Sarah, I want table 12 set up with our finest linens and the crystal stemware we reserve for VIP guests, I instructed during another covert phone call from my childhood bedroom. And please make sure our sommelier James is available to personally handle the wine pairings. I want every element of this dinner to be exceptional. The logistical challenges were more complex than my family could have imagined. I was essentially producing a high-end private dining experience while maintaining the illusion that I was just another family member attending a birthday celebration. I had to coordinate with my staff to ensure perfect service without revealing my identity to my family, manage the kitchen operations remotely while appearing to be a casual dinner guest, and orchestrate what would essentially be a masterclass in fine dining hospitality. The irony wasn't lost on me that while I was secretly orchestrating what would be one of the most elaborate dinner experiences my family had ever attended, they were still treating me like someone who needed their career advice. That morning, at breakfast, Vivian had cornered me again with another suggestion about corporate opportunities, apparently unaware that I was simultaneously managing a restaurant operation that employed more people than her entire law firm. Alexandra, I've been thinking more about what we discussed yesterday, she said, while I was discreetly texting my kitchen staff about the evening's special preparations. There's a legal consulting firm that specializes in restaurant law. They help restaurants with compliance, contracts, that sort of thing. It would be perfect for you. You'd get to use your restaurant knowledge, but in a professional setting with real growth potential. I nodded politely while simultaneously approving the wine selection that my sommelier had recommended for the evening's pairings. The contrast between her perception of my capabilities and the reality of what I was managing at that very moment was almost surreal. She saw someone who needed help finding a real job, while I was actually orchestrating a dining experience that would cost more per person than she typically spent on an entire week of meals. The afternoon brought additional challenges as I tried to balance family obligations with business responsibilities. While Penelope was showing me photos from her recent vacation and explaining why I should consider teaching, it's so much more stable than the restaurant business and you'd have summers off,
I was reviewing final details with my purchasing manager about the special order ingredients we were using for tonight's menu. The ingredients alone represented a level of sophistication that most people never encountered. We were serving wild-caught halibut from Alaska, locally foraged mushrooms that our chef had personally selected that morning, and organic vegetables from farms that supplied some of the most exclusive restaurants in the country. The wine pairings included bottles that cost more than most people's car payments, carefully selected to complement each course and create a progression of flavors that would tell a story throughout the evening. Meanwhile, my family was discussing the evening as if it were just another restaurant meal. "I hope the service is good," my mother mentioned while getting ready. "You know how disappointing it can be when restaurants can't handle larger groups." She had no idea that I had personally trained every server who would be working that evening, or that our service standards were so rigorous that we regularly received perfect scores from mystery diners sent by restaurant industry publications. Daniel was concerned about the menu options, wondering if the restaurant would be able to accommodate his girlfriend Carline's dietary restrictions. "These fancy places sometimes aren't very flexible," he said. "They get so caught up in their concept that they forget about customer service." He was expressing doubt about the flexibility of a restaurant where I had personally developed training programs that emphasized accommodating every guest's needs, no matter how complex or unusual. The most challenging part of the day was maintaining my composure while listening to their assumptions and concerns about the restaurant that I had poured my heart and soul into creating. They were treating Sunset Prime like just another dinner destination, a convenient venue for their family celebration, completely unaware that they were about to experience the culmination of years of culinary study, business development, and hospitality innovation. As the afternoon progressed, I made final adjustments to ensure that every detail would exceed their expectations. I arranged for a special floral centerpiece featuring my grandmother's favorite flowers. I coordinated with the kitchen to ensure that her meal would be served at exactly the temperature she preferred. I even arranged for a special musical selection to be played during dessert, a collection of songs from her youth that I knew would make her emotional in the best possible way.
By evening, I had orchestrated what would essentially be a $2,000 per person dining experience disguised as a family birthday dinner. Every element had been carefully planned and executed to create an unforgettable evening that would showcase the very best of what I had built. And my family would experience it all while remaining completely oblivious to the fact that the person they had been offering career advice to all weekend was actually the mastermind behind every perfect detail they were about to enjoy. The moment we walked through the doors of Sunset Prime, I felt a surge of pride mixed with nervous anticipation. The restaurant looked absolutely stunning. Every detail I had obsessed over during the design phase was working in perfect harmony. The warm Edison bulb lighting cast a golden glow over the exposed brick walls. The open kitchen allowed glimpses of the culinary artistry happening behind the scenes. And the carefully curated jazz playlist created an atmosphere that was both sophisticated and welcoming. My grandmother gasped audibly as we entered. "Dios mío, this place is absolutely beautiful," she said, clutching my arm and looking around with wide eyes. "How did you find such an elegant restaurant, Patricia?" she asked my mother, who was beaming as if she had personally discovered this hidden gem. "The Hendricks recommended it. They said it's the best new restaurant in the area. Impossible to get reservations. We were so lucky they had a table available for tonight." She had no idea that the luck involved the owner personally blocking off the best table in the house and arranging for VIP treatment that would normally require weeks of advanced planning and connections. The hostess, Jennifer, whom I hired personally and trained in our hospitality standards, greeted us with the perfect balance of professionalism and warmth. "Good evening and welcome to Sunset Prime. We're honored to have you celebrating with us tonight." I caught her eye briefly and gave an almost imperceptible nod, our prearranged signal that everything should proceed exactly as planned. As we were led to table 12, positioned perfectly with a view of both the kitchen and the main dining room, I watched my family take in the ambiance with obvious appreciation. Daniel was impressed by the open kitchen concept, commenting to Caroline about how sophisticated and modern it was. Penelope was admiring the artwork on the walls.
pieces I had personally selected from local artists to create a gallery-like atmosphere that would spark conversation. Vivian, ever the critic, was examining everything with the discerning eye of someone accustomed to fine dining. "This is actually quite impressive," she said to her husband Marcus, sounding almost surprised. "The interior design is much more thoughtful than most restaurants in this area. Someone really knows what they're doing." We had barely settled into our seats when the first blow came. James, our sommelier, approached the table with the wine list and began his practiced presentation about our carefully curated selection. Before he could finish his introduction, Vivian interrupted him with a dismissive wave. "Excuse me," she said in the tone she typically reserved for cross-examining hostile witnesses. "Could you please send over someone who actually knows about wine? We're celebrating a special occasion, and we need someone with real expertise, not," she gestured vaguely at James, who had 15 years of experience and multiple sommelier certifications, "a server playing dress-up." The insult stung, not just because James was incredibly knowledgeable and professional, but because it represented exactly the kind of dismissive attitude my family had toward service industry professionals. James handled it with perfect grace, simply nodding and saying, "Of course, I'll have our wine director speak with you personally." But Vivian wasn't finished. As James walked away, she turned to the table with a smug expression. "You have to be firm with restaurant staff, or they'll try to upsell you with overpriced bottles and pretentious descriptions. Most servers don't actually know anything about wine. They just memorize a few talking points." I felt my face flush with anger, but I stayed silent, watching one of my most knowledgeable employees being dismissed and insulted by someone who had no idea what she was talking about. James knew more about wine than everyone at our table combined, including Vivian, whose expertise came from ordering expensive bottles at client dinners and reading Wine Spectator. The second humiliation came when Sarah, my general manager, approached our table to personally welcome us and ensure everything was perfect. Sarah was extraordinary at her job. She had increased our customer satisfaction scores by 40% since joining our team and had a gift for making every guest feel like the most important person in the restaurant. "Good evening, everyone. I'm Sarah, and I'll be personally overseeing your dining experience tonight. Is there anything special I can arrange to make your celebration even more memorable?" Before anyone else could respond, Daniel jumped in with his medical authority voice. "Actually, yes, my girlfriend has some dietary restrictions that I'm not sure your kitchen can handle properly. She's gluten-sensitive, dairy-free, and doesn't eat nightshades. Can your cooks actually accommodate that, or should we just order something simple and safe?" The condescension in his tone was unmistakable. He was speaking to Sarah as if she worked at a roadside diner rather than an upscale restaurant known for accommodating complex dietary needs. Sarah, to her credit, responded with perfect professionalism, explaining our kitchen's extensive experience with dietary modifications and offering to have our executive chef personally prepare something special for Caroline. "That won't be necessary. Just have your cooks prepare some plain grilled chicken and vegetables. Nothing fancy. When kitchens try to get creative with dietary restrictions, they usually mess it up."
I watched Sarah's expression remain perfectly composed, even as she was being told that our award-winning kitchen staff, chefs I had recruited from some of the best restaurants in the country, couldn't be trusted to prepare a simple modified dish. She nodded graciously and assured him that Caroline's meal would be prepared exactly as requested. The third and most devastating humiliation came when our server, Michael, began presenting the evening's special tasting menu. Michael was one of our best servers, knowledgeable about every ingredient and preparation method, passionate about food, and skilled at creating memorable dining experiences for our guests. As Michael began explaining the first course, seared diver scallops with cauliflower puree and pancetta chips, Vivian cut him off mid-sentence. "Excuse me," she said with the kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes, "but could you please just bring us regular menus? We're not really interested in the whole production. We just want to order our food and enjoy our family dinner without all the..." she gestured dismissively. Theatrical descriptions. The dismissal was crushing to watch. Michael had spent months learning about our sourcing, our techniques, and our culinary philosophy, so he could share that passion with guests who were interested in understanding what made their dining experience special. Vivian had just reduced all of that knowledge and enthusiasm to theatrical descriptions and production. But she wasn't done. As Michael stepped away to get regular menus, she turned to the table with a patronizing smile. I don't understand why restaurants feel the need to make everything so complicated these days. It's just food. All the fancy descriptions and elaborate presentations are usually just ways to justify overcharging for simple dishes. She was talking about my life's work, my passion, my carefully crafted culinary vision, as if it were some kind of pretentious scam designed to separate customers from their money. Every dish on our menu represented hours of development, testing, and refinement. Every presentation choice had been made with intention and care. Every elaborate technique served a purpose in creating flavors and textures that couldn't be achieved through simple cooking methods. The final insult came when the conversation turned to careers, as it inevitably did with my family. Uncle Charles, emboldened by the wine and the elegant setting, decided this was the perfect moment to renew his campaign to rescue me from my poor life choices. "You know, Alexandra," he said loudly enough for nearby tables to hear, "being in a place like this really makes me think about what you could accomplish if you applied your restaurant experience to something more substantial. This is obviously a successful establishment, but imagine if you could be on the management side of something like this instead of just working as a server." The words hit me like a physical blow. I was sitting in my own restaurant, surrounded by staff I had hired and trained, experiencing a dinner I had personally orchestrated, and my uncle was suggesting that I should aspire to work in management at a place like this instead of wasting my time just working as a server. The table went quiet for a moment, and I felt all eyes on me, waiting for my response. My grandmother looked uncomfortable, clearly sensing the tension, while the rest of my family seemed to be waiting for me to thank Uncle Charles for his wisdom and insight. "I'm actually quite happy with my current situation," I managed to say, my voice barely steady. "But honey," my mother jumped in, "you're not getting any younger. Don't you want security, benefits, a real career path? Places like this don't just happen. They're built by serious business people with vision and capital. You could learn so much from observing how a really successful restaurant operates." I sat there in stunned silence, being lectured about restaurant operations and business vision by people who were experiencing the fruits of my own vision and business acumen without having the slightest clue. They were praising the very thing I had built, while simultaneously expressing pity for my inability to achieve something similar. The evening had reached its lowest point when I noticed a commotion near the front entrance of the restaurant. Through the dining room, I could see Jennifer, our hostess, speaking animatedly with someone I couldn't quite make out. She kept gesturing toward our table, and I felt a knot form in my stomach as I realized what was happening. Jonathan Webb, the restaurant critic for Metropolitan Dining magazine, had arrived for what I suddenly remembered was a scheduled interview. 3 weeks ago, his editor had contacted me about featuring Sunset Prime in their upcoming Rising Stars of Regional Dining cover story. In the chaos of planning my grandmother's celebration and managing my family's visit, I had completely forgotten that we had arranged for him to stop by tonight to photograph the restaurant and conduct a brief interview about my expansion plans. Jonathan was approaching our table with a photographer in tow, both of them clearly looking for me. My heart began racing as I realized that my carefully maintained anonymity was about to be shattered in the most public and dramatic way possible. There was no escape, no way to signal them to wait, no method of controlling how this revelation would unfold in front of my unsuspecting family. "Excuse me?" Jonathan said politely, addressing our cable as he approached. "I'm looking for Alexandra Rivera. I'm Jonathan Webb from Metropolitan Dining magazine, and we had scheduled an interview this evening about her remarkable success with Sunset Dining Group." The table fell completely silent. Every conversation stopped mid-sentence. Vivian, who had been in the middle of explaining to Caroline why fancy restaurants were overrated, simply stared with her mouth slightly open. Daniel's fork remained suspended halfway to his mouth, loaded with the simple grilled chicken that our award-winning kitchen had prepared for his girlfriend's dietary restrictions. "I'm sorry," my mother said, clearly confused, "but I think there's been some mistake. We're just here for a family birthday dinner." Jonathan looked puzzled and consulted his notes. "No mistake. Alexandra Rivera, founder and CEO of Sunset Dining Group. We're doing a feature story about her expansion into 7 states and her innovative approach to elevated comfort food. She should be at this table. This is the reservation that was made for the interview." Uncle Charles was the first to find his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Alexandra Rivera? That's our Alexandra?" "Yes, sir," Jonathan replied with growing enthusiasm, now clearly identifying me at the table. "Ms. Rivera has built one of the most impressive restaurant empires we've seen from someone under 30. 6 locations, with plans for expansion into Texas and Colorado next year. Her flagship location here in Millbrook Heights has been booked solid since opening, and industry insiders are calling her the most promising entrepreneur in upscale casual dining." The photographer, meanwhile, had begun setting up his equipment and was taking preliminary shots of the dining room. "These photos are going to be part of our cover story," he explained to our stunned table. "Ms. Rivera's restaurants are being studied by business schools as examples of rapid scaling without compromising quality or brand identity." I could see my family members processing this information in real time, their faces cycling through confusion, disbelief, and slowly dawning realization. Vivian was staring at me as if I had suddenly sprouted wings, while Daniel appeared to be having difficulty breathing normally. "I'm sorry," Penelope interjected, her voice shaky, "but are you saying that our Alexandra, owns this restaurant?" "This restaurant and 5 others," Jonathan confirmed with a smile. "Sunset Prime is actually her newest location, opened just 6 weeks ago, but she started with Sunset Bistro in Oakland 8 years ago and has built the company into a $50 million operation. We're particularly interested in her employee profit-sharing programs and her commitment to sustainable sourcing practices." The photographer had moved closer to our table and was now taking pictures that would accompany the article. "Miss Rivera, if you don't mind, we'd love to get some shots of you in your restaurant. The story will focus on how you've maintained the personal touch while expanding operations across multiple states." My grandmother was the first to react with pure joy. "Mi nieta!" she exclaimed, tears immediately springing to her eyes. "I knew you were doing something special, but I had no idea it was this big." She reached across the table and grabbed my hands with surprising strength. $50 million? In serio? The rest of my family remained frozen in various states of shock. Marcus, Vivian's husband, was frantically pulling out his phone, presumably to Google search for information about Sunset Dining Group. Penelope was staring at the elegant dining room around us, as if seeing it for the first time, which, in a way, she was. Jonathan continued his explanation, oblivious to the family drama he was creating. "What's particularly impressive about Ms. Rivera's success is how she's maintained quality control across multiple locations. Each restaurant maintains the same high standards for both food and service, which is incredibly difficult to achieve during rapid expansion. Food and Wine called her the gold standard for how to scale a restaurant concept without losing its soul." Vivian finally found her voice, though it was several octaves higher than usual. "Alexandra? You own this entire restaurant? Like, you're the actual owner?" "And 5 others," I replied quietly, my voice barely audible over the blood pounding in my ears. The photographer was now directing me to stand for some individual shots. "We want to capture you in the environment you've created. The story is about visionary entrepreneurs who are reshaping the dining landscape, and your restaurants are perfect examples of how innovation and tradition can work together." Daniel was staring at the open kitchen where our executive chef was personally overseeing the preparation of dishes. That's your kitchen? Those are your chefs?" "Marcus Chen is our executive chef. I recruited him from Atelier Cren in San Francisco. He's been instrumental in developing our signature dishes and maintaining consistency across all locations."
The Marcus Chen? Caroline whispered, suddenly looking starstruck. He's like famous. I've read articles about him in Food and Wine. Jonathan nodded enthusiastically. Ms. Rivera has assembled an incredible team of culinary talent. Her ability to attract top-tier chefs and management to her restaurants has been a key factor in the company's success. The industry is watching very closely to see how she continues to scale while maintaining these quality standards. Uncle Charles was now staring at me with an expression I had never seen before, something between awe and mortification. The man who had spent the entire weekend offering me entry-level corporate positions was slowly realizing that he had been providing career advice to someone whose annual income probably exceeded his by several multiples. The wine program here is also getting national attention. Your sommelier selection has been praised by Wine Spectator, and I understand you've developed relationships with some very exclusive vintners. Vivian, who had dismissed James as incompetent just an hour ago, now looked like she wanted to disappear into her chair. The server playing dress-up she had insulted was apparently respected enough to be featured in wine industry publications.
My mother was looking around the restaurant with new eyes, finally understanding that every detail she had been admiring, from the lighting to the artwork to the menu design, had been conceived and executed by her daughter, the one she had been offering career counseling to all weekend. "We're particularly excited about your expansion plans," Jonathan said, consulting his notes again. "Opening 3 new locations next year while maintaining your commitment to local sourcing and community involvement. It's exactly the kind of responsible growth that the industry needs to see more of." The photographer finished his shots and began packing up his equipment. "These photos are going to be beautiful," he told me. "The magazine should be out next month, and we're expecting this to be one of our most popular issues of the year." As Jonathan and the photographer prepared to leave, he handed me his business card and shook my hand warmly. "Thank you for your time, Miss Rivera. We're honored to feature your story, and we'll be following your continued success with great interest." After they left, our table remained in absolute silence. The only sounds were the ambient noise of the restaurant, my restaurant, continuing to operate around us. My family sat motionless, each of them processing the complete reversal of everything they thought they knew about my life and career. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. I watched as each family member grappled with the complete reconstruction of their understanding of who I was and what I had accomplished. The cognitive dissonance was almost visible on their faces as they tried to reconcile the unsuccessful family member they had been pitying with the accomplished CEO who had just been featured for a magazine cover story. Vivian was the first to attempt damage control, though her voice lacked its usual confidence. "Alexandra, we had no idea. Why didn't you tell us? I mean, this is incredible. A $50 million company? That's extraordinary." She was speaking carefully, as if testing each word before saying it, clearly aware that everything she had said earlier in the evening now sounded embarrassingly ignorant. "I tried to tell you," I replied quietly, my voice steady despite the emotions churning inside me. "Every time I mentioned my business success, you interpreted it as a problem that needed to be solved. When I said I was expanding, you worried I was taking on too much. When I mentioned multiple locations, you suggested I should focus on just one. You never asked about revenue, profit margins, or growth strategies. You just assumed I was struggling and needed your advice about finding a real career." Daniel was staring at his plate, the irony of the situation clearly dawning on him. "The kitchen staff I was worried couldn't handle Caroline's dietary restrictions. Those are your chefs, the ones you hired and trained." "Marcus personally prepared Caroline's meal," I confirmed. "He's worked in some of the most prestigious kitchens in the country, and dietary accommodations are one of his specialties. When you requested simple grilled chicken, he actually created a sophisticated preparation with herbs and techniques that elevated it far beyond what you were expecting, even though you specifically asked for nothing fancy." Caroline looked mortified. "It was the best grilled chicken I've ever had. I wondered why it tasted so complex and flavorful. I actually told Daniel on the way here that this was probably going to be overpriced and pretentious, but the food has been absolutely incredible." Uncle Charles was rubbing his forehead as if he had a headache.
Alexandra, I spent this entire weekend trying to help you find corporate restaurant management positions. I was offering you entry-level opportunities at companies that probably generate less revenue than what you make in a single quarter. Your heart was in the right place, I said, though we both knew how condescending his offers had been. But you never asked about my actual financial situation or business performance. You just assumed that because I work in restaurants, I must need rescuing from poverty and instability. My mother was looking around the dining room with new eyes, finally understanding the sophistication of what she was experiencing. Every detail of this place, the lighting, the music, the service, the food presentation, you designed all of this? I was involved in every aspect, I confirmed, from the interior design concept to the staff training programs to the menu development. This isn't just a restaurant I own, it's a vision I created and executed. The same is true for all 6 locations. Penelope was shaking her head slowly. When you said you were working in restaurants, I pictured you as a server or maybe a shift manager, working for someone else's company. I never imagined you were building your own empire. The scale of what you've accomplished, it's like nothing anyone in our family has ever achieved. That's part of the problem, my grandmother interjected, speaking for the first time since her initial burst of excitement. This family has very narrow ideas about what success looks like. Everyone assumes that the only valuable careers are the traditional ones: law, medicine, corporate jobs with established companies. No one bothered to learn what Alexandra was actually building because they couldn't see past their own prejudices about the restaurant industry. The truth of her words hung in the air. My family had been so committed to their predetermined notions about career hierarchies that they had been incapable of recognizing entrepreneurial success when it was happening right in front of them. The worst part, I continued, is that you spent years making me feel like I was disappointing you, like I was wasting my potential and making poor choices. Do you have any idea what it's like to achieve everything you dreamed of and more, only to have your own family treat your success as evidence of failure?
Vivian's eyes were filling with tears. Alexandra, I am so sorry. I thought I was being helpful, offering guidance to someone who was... She couldn't finish the sentence because saying it out loud would mean admitting how wrong and condescending she had been. Someone who was what? I asked gently. Someone who was too stupid to recognize that her career was a dead end? Someone who needed the wisdom of her more successful relatives to see the error of her ways? Someone who was struggling, she whispered. I genuinely thought you were struggling financially and professionally, and I wanted to help you find stability. Daniel was nodding in agreement. We all thought that. We saw you working in restaurants and assumed you were barely getting by, working multiple jobs, living paycheck to paycheck. The idea that you were actually building wealth and employing hundreds of people, it never occurred to us. That's because you never asked, I pointed out. You never inquired about my actual experiences, my income, my goals, and my satisfaction with my choices. You just saw someone working in food service and applied all your assumptions about what that must mean. The conversation was interrupted by James, our sommelier, approaching the table with a special bottle of champagne. Compliments of the house, he said with a warm smile. We wanted to celebrate your magazine feature and your grandmother's birthday with something very special. He presented a bottle of Dom Perignon Vintage 2008, the same champagne I had originally planned to bring to Easter dinner to celebrate my expansion deal. Vivian looked at James with new respect, remembering how she had dismissed him earlier in the evening. I owe you an apology, she said quietly. I was rude to you earlier, and it was completely unacceptable. You clearly know far more about wine than I do. James handled the apology with grace. No offense taken. We're honored to be serving you this evening. As he opened the champagne and began pouring, he addressed the table. Miss Rivera has created something really special with Sunset Dining Group. She's not just our owner, she's someone who genuinely cares about excellence in every aspect of the business. We're all proud to work for her. After James left, my Uncle Charles raised his glass for a toast.
Alexandra, I don't know how to apologize for this weekend, for this entire year, for everything. You've accomplished something remarkable, and instead of celebrating your success, we've been treating you like a charity case who needed our help. I'm embarrassed, and I'm sorry. The rest of the family raised their glasses, and my grandmother offered her own toast. To my granddaughter, who had the vision to build something beautiful and the strength to persist even when her own family couldn't see what she was achieving. I'm proud of you, mija, and I'm sorry it took a magazine interview for everyone else to understand what I've known all along. As we finished our champagne and the evening wound down, I realized this experience had changed our family dynamics permanently. The revelation had shattered their assumptions about both my life and their own understanding of success and achievement. They could never again dismiss my career choices or offer me unsolicited advice about finding real opportunities. But the most important lesson wasn't about money or recognition. It was about the danger of making assumptions about other people's lives based on limited information and personal biases. My family had been so committed to their ideas about what careers were valuable and what success looked like that they had been blind to a remarkable achievement happening within their own family. The drive back to my parents' house was quiet, each of us processing what had happened. My family now understood that the person they had been offering career advice to was actually more successful than any of them, that the industry they had dismissed as unstable and unprofitable had generated more wealth than their traditional careers, and their unsuccessful family member was about to be featured on the cover of a national magazine. But the most important lesson wasn't about money or recognition. It was about the danger of making assumptions about other people's lives based on limited information and personal biases. My family had been so committed to their ideas about what careers were valuable and what success looked like that they had been blind to a remarkable achievement happening within their own family. As we pulled into the driveway, my grandmother squeezed my hand. "Next year," she said with a mischievous smile, "let's have my birthday party at your restaurant in Texas." I laughed, feeling lighter than I had in years. "It's a deal, abuela. But next time, I'm telling everyone up front that I'm the owner." The truth had finally set us all free.